For over a decade, the music industry told the world that Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey hated each other. Magazines ran headlines pitting them against one another. Radio hosts argued about who had the greater voice. Record executives privately whispered that the two women refused to be in the same room together. The rivalry between them was treated as one of the defining wars of 1990s pop culture, as real and as permanent as the Cold War itself. But there was a secret that almost nobody knew. A secret that only came to light in the early hours of February 12th, 2012, when a phone call reached a home in New York City, and what the person on the other end said next silenced everyone who was present in that room. What she did in the weeks that followed changed everything the world thought it knew about two women who had spent 15 years being told they were each other's greatest enemy. If you grew up listening to the greatest voices of the 20th century, if you remember what it felt like to hear those songs for the very first time, then this story is for you. Because the truth about Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey is not the story that was sold to the world. The real story is something far more human, far more painful, and far more beautiful than anything the tabloids ever printed. To understand what happened between Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the moment their rivalry supposedly started, but to the moment the music industry decided it needed one. Whitney Houston was already a phenomenon by the time Mariah Carey arrived. When Whitney's debut album hit stores in 1985, she was 21 years old, the daughter of gospel royalty, a young woman who had grown up in the church choirs of New Jersey breathing music like oxygen. Her voice was not simply an instrument. It was an event. By the time she recorded I Will Always Love You for the Bodyguard soundtrack in 1992, Whitney Houston was the standard by which all other singers were measured. Then Mariah Carey walked into that world, and suddenly the industry had a problem it had not anticipated. Mariah was signed to Columbia Records in 1988 after Tommy Mottola heard a demo tape at a party and pursued her before anyone else could. Her debut album came out in 1990, and the range she displayed was extraordinary, a whistle register that seemed to exist somewhere beyond ordinary limits, stacked on top of a lower register that was warm and rich and deeply felt. The industry's response was not to celebrate the fact that two extraordinary voices existed simultaneously in the same generation. Its response was to create a competition. Record executives, radio programmers, and entertainment journalists all understood something fundamental about how celebrity culture worked in the early 1990s. Rivalry sold. It sold magazines. It sold radio airtime. It sold the idea that music was a sport with winners and losers, that there could only be one queen at the top, and that the audience needed to pick a side. So they manufactured one. They placed Whitney and Mariah in opposition to each other in interviews, asking each woman what she thought of the other's voice, waiting for a moment of frustration that could be turned into a headline. They framed Grammy nominations as battles. They ran reader polls asking which singer was superior. They created a narrative of animosity so persistent and so thoroughly repeated that it eventually became accepted as fact, believed by fans who had absorbed the story simply through repetition. But what was actually happening behind the scenes, away from the cameras and the magazine covers and the radio studios, was something the narrative of rivalry could not contain. The people who worked closely with both women during those years have spoken carefully about this, in interviews given long after the events themselves. What they describe is not a Cold War between two enemies. Both Whitney and Mariah understood, in ways that most people around them did not, what it actually cost to be a black woman carrying the weight of an entire industry's expectations. Whitney had grown up in the shadow of her mother Cissy Houston's career, had spent years being told by industry figures that she needed to sand down the gospel edges of her voice to make it more commercially acceptable. Mariah had experienced her own version of this pressure, her biracial identity a source of complicated expectation, her relationship with Tommy Mottola rapidly transforming from professional partnership into something those close to her would describe as controlling and isolating. These were two women navigating enormous personal and professional pressures while the world watched and judged. And the world had decided, without asking either of them, that they should be enemies. There were moments of genuine tension. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The music industry's habit of placing them in direct competition created situations where friction was almost inevitable, where a careless comment in an interview could be amplified into something that looked like an attack, where the exhaustion of constant comparison could make two people who had more in common than almost anyone else in their industry seem like opponents. People close to Whitney have said that she found the constant comparison wearying not because she felt threatened, but because she understood what it was really doing, reducing two complete human beings into competing products, stripping away everything that made them individual in order to stage a spectacle that had nothing to do with either of their actual lives. People close to Mariah have said something remarkably similar. The rivalry was largely a construction that existed in press releases and entertainment television segments, rather than in any real exchange between the two of them. And then in 1998, something happened that the rivalry narrative had never accounted for. The two women were placed in the same recording studio, asked to record the same song together, and what emerged from those sessions told a story that no magazine had ever printed. The animated film The Prince of Egypt, DreamWorks' ambitious retelling of the story of Moses, required a closing song that could carry the emotional weight of the entire film. The producers chose When You Believe, a ballad about hope and perseverance, and they made a decision that many people in the industry considered either inspired or catastrophically risky. They would record it as a duet between Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey. Every entertainment journalist immediately began predicting disaster. The story that had been told for years about their rivalry seemed to make the collaboration almost impossibly fraught. But people who were present in the studio during those recording sessions have described what actually happened as something genuinely surprising. The tension that everyone had predicted never materialized in the way the narrative required. What happened instead was more interesting. Two women who had been told for years that they were each other's greatest threat sat together in a room and sang. They listened to each other. They adjusted their phrasing to make space for the other's voice. They worked through the technical challenges of blending two registers as distinctive as theirs with the professionalism of people who had been doing exactly this work their entire lives. There were difficult moments. The sessions took longer than expected, and the process of finding a key that suited both voices equally was genuinely complicated. Whitney was in the middle of a period in her personal life that was becoming increasingly turbulent, the marriage to Bobby Brown cycling through a pattern of intensity and crisis that would define those years for her. Mariah was navigating the slow deterioration of her marriage to Tommy Mottola, a process that would eventually culminate in a very public breakdown. Neither woman was at her easiest. But what the people who were present describe, when the technical difficulties and personal pressures are set aside, is two singers who recognized something in each other that went deeper than competition. They recognized the specific loneliness of being told your whole life that you are exceptional and discovering that exceptionalism is its own kind of isolation. They recognized the exhaustion. They recognized the cost. When the song was released, it reached #1 in multiple countries and became one of the best-selling singles of 1998. More than its commercial success, it became evidence of something the rivalry narrative had no room for, that these two women could coexist, could create something together, could occupy the same space without the world ending. The years that followed were not easy for either of them. Whitney's struggles became increasingly public in the early 2000s, the addiction that had been a private battle for years becoming impossible to conceal from the cameras that followed her everywhere. She appeared on television looking diminished in ways that frightened her fans, her voice audibly affected by what her body was going through, her behavior erratic in the way that addiction makes behavior erratic, unpredictable and heartbreaking in equal measure. The woman who had once seemed invincible was visibly fighting something that was winning. Mariah's own crisis came in the summer of 2001, a very public breakdown that she has spoken about with remarkable honesty in the years since, the accumulated weight of years of pressure, and a controlling marriage finally overwhelming the structures that had been holding everything in place. She was hospitalized. She appeared in interviews that people found disturbing and could not look away from. The two women whose rivalry had been one of the defining entertainment stories of the 1990s were now both publicly struggling in their different ways. And the narrative the industry had built around them had no useful language for what was actually happening. What people close to both women have confirmed is that during these years, something quiet was happening between them that the public never saw, a recognition that passed through the specific channels existing between people who have experienced similar things, that the other person was going through something real. Whitney's road to recovery was not linear. She made a comeback album in 2009, I Look to You, which demonstrated that the voice was still there underneath everything that had happened to it, capable of moments of the old power that made people catch their breath. She toured. She struggled. She had periods of stability and periods where the stability collapsed. She talked in interviews about faith, about her daughter Bobby Christina, about the things that anchored her when everything else felt unsteady. She talked about music as the one place where everything else fell away, and she was simply herself, the self that existed before the fame and the damage. Mariah, in the years following her own crisis, had rebuilt herself with a kind of deliberate, almost fierce intentionality. She had married, had twins, and continued making music that demonstrated her gifts were still fully intact. She had developed a particular quality of empathy toward people who were publicly struggling, the empathy of someone who knew from inside what it actually felt like. And then came February 11th, 2012. Whitney Houston checked into the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills for what was supposed to be a celebratory weekend. Clive Davis, the legendary record executive who had guided her career, was holding his annual pre-Grammy party at the hotel the following evening, and Whitney was expected to attend. She had been in good spirits in the days leading up to the weekend, people who spoke with her said. She had been talking about her daughter, about music, about the future. There were recordings she wanted to make. The future still felt like something that belonged to her. On the afternoon of February 11th, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in her hotel room bathtub. She was 48 years old. The cause of death was later determined to be accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The years of damage had taken their toll in the most final way possible, and the voice that had defined a generation was gone before anyone was ready to accept that this was something that could actually happen. The news spread with the speed that devastating news always spreads, moving from hotel corridors, to phone calls, to television broadcasts, to the particular numbness that settles over a world when it has lost something irreplaceable. Mariah Carey was at home in New York when she received the call that Whitney was gone. The people who were present in the room with her when she learned what had happened have spoken about those moments with the careful hesitation of people who witnessed something that felt private even in their presence. Mariah went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, though shock was certainly part of it, but the stillness of someone absorbing information slowly because to absorb it quickly would be to make it real faster than the body can tolerate. And then she said something quietly, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room simultaneously, that the people present have described in different words, but with the same essential meaning. She said that she had loved Whitney, not admired, not respected as a fellow professional. Loved her, in the particular way that you love someone who has understood something about your life that almost no one else has been able to understand. Someone whose existence has been a form of companionship, even across the distances that separate people who do not spend much time in the same room. She said that the world did not know what it was losing because it had never really known what it had. And then she was quiet for a very long time. In the days and weeks that followed Whitney's death, Mariah did something that surprised many people who had spent years absorbing the rivalry narrative. She refused to perform. She canceled appearances. She withdrew from public events. People around her described someone in genuine mourning, not performing grief for cameras, but sitting with a loss that had landed deep and private. She spoke about Whitney in interviews with a directness that cut through the careful language that celebrities typically use when discussing deaths of other celebrities. Mariah did not maintain professional distance. She spoke about missing her. She spoke about the specific quality of Whitney's voice as something that existed in a category by itself, something the world would not hear again. She spoke about the years of comparison and rivalry as something that had been done to both of them rather than something that had existed between them, a construction that had obscured a relationship that was something more complicated and more tender than a competition. She said, in one interview that many people found unexpectedly devastating, that she hoped Whitney knew. She hoped Whitney knew how she had felt, because she had not always said it in ways loud enough to be heard over the noise of everything else. What Mariah revealed in those weeks, piece by piece, was a portrait of a relationship that the public had never been shown, a connection built not on rivalry, but on recognition, on the specific understanding that passes between two people who have lived through versions of the same experience. They had both grown up as exceptional voices being shaped and commercialized by an industry that understood their talent, but could not always be trusted to understand their humanity. They had both experienced the particular loneliness of fame, The way that being known by millions of people does not translate into being known. The way that celebrity creates a kind of insulation between a person and genuine connection. They had both spent years being compared to each other by people who were simultaneously celebrating them and reducing them, holding them up as the greatest voices of their generation, while treating them as competing products rather than complete human beings. They had both survived things that had nearly destroyed them, and they had come out the other side with the knowledge that survival gives you, that most things are more fragile than they appear, that time is not guaranteed, that the things left unsaid accumulate into regrets that cannot be undone. Mariah had said that she hoped Whitney knew, but the people who knew both women have suggested that Whitney did know, in the way that things can be known between people who have never quite found the language for them, carried in the space between words rather than in the words themselves. The Grammy Awards ceremony took place the following evening, February 12, 2012, less than 24 hours after Whitney's death was confirmed. The show went forward because the show, as the music industry has always understood, must go forward. But it was transformed by the weight of what had happened the day before, the performances and the speeches all taking place under the shadow of an absence that everyone in the room was feeling. Jennifer Hudson sang a tribute that left the auditorium in tears. LL Cool J opened the ceremony with a prayer. The people who were present described a night that felt simultaneously like a celebration and a funeral, a night when the usual logic of award shows had been suspended by something more urgent and more real. Mariah was not at the Grammys that year. She had decided not to attend, and the decision was understood by the people who knew her as part of the same mourning she had entered in the hours after receiving the news. She watched from home, alone with the loss, in the way that sometimes the most significant grief requires privacy rather than public witness. In the years since Whitney's death, Mariah has continued to speak about her in ways that gradually dismantled the rivalry narrative that defined how the world understood their relationship for so long. She has spoken about listening to Whitney's recordings as a young woman and understanding for the first time what a human voice was capable of, the ceiling of possibility being lifted to somewhere she had not known it could reach. She has spoken about the specific quality of Whitney's sound, the way she could hold a note and locate within it an emotional precision that was not simply technical mastery, but something deeper, something connected to a life fully lived and fully felt. She has spoken about what it meant to both of them to exist in an industry that could not quite contain them, that needed to pit them against each other because the alternative, simply celebrating two extraordinary things simultaneously, was apparently more than the machinery of celebrity culture could manage. And she has spoken, repeatedly, and with a directness that has moved many of the people who heard it, about the love. About the love that existed between them in the form that love takes between people who understand each other from a distance, who recognize each other across the space that separates them, who carry each other's existence as a kind of companionship through the years when everything else is uncertain. The rivalry that the world was sold was not the real story. The real story was always something quieter and more lasting than that. What the story of Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey actually tells us, when the narrative constructed around them is set aside, is something about the cost of reducing people to their most commercially useful characteristics. Two women who had more in common than almost any other two people in their industry were presented to the world as opposites, as competitors, as enemies, because that framing was more useful to the machinery around them than the truth. The truth was that they were both exceptional, both struggling, both carrying the particular weight of being extraordinary in a world that could not always figure out what to do with extraordinary women. The truth was that they recognized each other across the distances the industry kept placing between them, in ways that the rivalry narrative could not accommodate. The truth was that when Whitney died, the person who mourned her with the depth of someone who had genuinely known her was the person the world had been told was her enemy. The rivalry was a story. The love was real. And Mariah's quiet words in a room in New York on the night of February 11, 2012, were the most honest things said about the relationship between the two greatest voices of their generation in the 20 years the world had been watching them. She loved her. She hoped she knew. And the hope, the quiet, persistent hope that the right things had been understood even when they had not been said, was the only thing left to hold on to when the voice that had defined everything went silent. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something important about the people we lose before we say what needs to be said, Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and ring the notification bell for more stories about the real human beings behind the music that shaped your life. Because the stories that matter most are almost never the ones we were told first.